Talking now with a man who shares people's incredible stories. A woman who was shot 12 times, a man who was mauled by a grizzly bear.
A lighthouse keeper. Clearly these stories have a wide range, but they all have one thing in common. A local podcast host wants to know what they were like. Scott Johnson, host of What Was That Like? Scott, thank you for joining us.
Sure, glad to be here.
Now, of course, I'm most intrigued by the lighthouse keeper. We should get to the things that actually have real sustenance to them. But first, how did you start this podcast? Did you just have like a lot of curiosity and you needed to just realize it?
I do have a lot of curiosity, and I started listening to podcasts back in 2012, and I found that every once in a while a podcast that I'd be listening to would have somebody telling a story, and even better if it was a true story. And I found that those were my favorite episodes. I loved listening to that. So I looked around and I couldn't see any other podcast doing that. And I figured, okay, I'll do it myself.
And you have found some incredible stories, things that people have survived. For example, let's talk about Dan, who was mauled by a grizzly bear.
That is a crazy story. Dan is an avid outdoorsman. He lives in Alaska, and he had actually had encounters with bears in the past, and he knew how to handle it, how to be safe. And but this time he inadvertently got between the bear and her cubs, not realizing that. And the consequences were disastrous. But he tells a great story, and it actually has a happy ending.
That's what we like to hear.
How nice Scott's voice is, though. Like, you want to hear this guy do a podcast.
I do.
You know what I mean? It has resonance when you talk. It's very deep, and it has bravado. I want to get to another episode you did about a woman named Jennifer, who caused a fatal accident, which is a lot of people's worst nightmare.
Yes, and this was actually the very first episode of my podcast. I was able to get Jennifer to tell her story. She lives in Texas, and she was driving with her two young children, and it was nighttime, and she pulled into an intersection, not noticing the motorcycle was approaching from her left. And he hit her, and he ended up dying. And what the intense part of that story, there's several aspects that are intense, but I was able to get the 911 audio that she made from the scene while she's there in the street with this man that was driving the motorcycle, and she hadn't even heard that. She had to give the whole episode to her therapist for him to kind of listen and prepare her to be able to listen to that. But there's so much to talk about like that, with the financial aspect of hiring a lawyer and having to explain to your kids mommy might have to go to prison, and the guilt, even though it was determined to be not her fault. There's a lot to talk about there.
What is it like, do you find, for these people to share their stories with you? Is it cathartic for many of them?
I've had several people tell me that yes, some people have said, this is the first time I've told the whole story verbally in detail to someone, and they found it very therapeutic just to kind of get it out there. Not that I'm a licensed counselor or anything, but just somebody to listen to them.
Yeah.
Scott, you also spoke with a woman who was shot 12 times but survived. How did she?
That was Whitney. She worked at an office building in Cincinnati, and she was walking into work one day, and she was on the phone, and the front door is a revolving door into the lobby of the office building. And while she was on the phone walking through that revolving door, she did not realize she was walking into an active shooter situation right there in the lobby. And the shooter saw the motion and turned and shot her 7 times, mostly down her right side. And she went down, but she was still conscious, but she couldn't stand up, and she said, I need to at least call my husband and say goodbye because I'm obviously going to die now. And so she reached for her phone, and the shooter saw that motion and shot her 5 more times.
Oh my gosh.
And but she still survived. And the picture that was with there, that was the officer that rescued her from that revolving door.
You also talk about happy stories and unusual jobs. What are some of your favorites there? I know Danny's very curious about the lighthouse keeper.
I just love lighthouses. I come from the Northeast, big fan.
Yeah, I used to live in Maine, so it kind of fascinated me as well.
Yes.
I like to, every once in a while, I throw in a lighthearted story just to kind of break up the tragedy of some of the other ones. And so I try to find people that have had unusual or have unusual jobs or occupations. And I thought in my head, this guy, I came across him, and he's a modern-day lighthouse keeper. And I thought it would be interesting, but I want to find out to make sure that my listeners would also find it interesting. So I have a private Facebook group, and I just put out a poll, And I said, would you guys like to hear about this? And it was unanimous. Yes, everybody wanted to hear about it.
Well, what was something interesting about it? What's like a little nugget that stuck out to you? Like, wow, keeping a lighthouse is much more interesting than I thought it was going to be.
The part that surprised me is he's on an island with this lighthouse almost exclusively, and yet he's married.
Huh.
His wife does not live there with him. They see each other every once in a while, but he's almost 99% of the time he's alone at this lighthouse location. So.
Interesting. Well, speaking of marriage, I love the one, and I'm glad we have time to get into it briefly. The couple who met through a wrong number. Can you tell us that story?
Yes, that's Casey. That's a wonderful story. She was traveling on business out of town, and she was supposed to meet up with some of her coworkers that were there. And so she sent a text message saying, hey, where is everybody? I want to hang out. And she sent it to the wrong number. And the person that answered her said, this is the wrong number, but if I was there, I'd hang out with you. And so they just started chatting back and forth, and 3 years later, they're married.
Wow. And thanks to you, we get to find out what that was like.
Exactly.
Scott Johnson, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Everybody, the podcast is called What Was That Like?